Hey, everybody. Welcome to our first edition of the 53-man roster prediction. We are doing it a little early before the third preseason game, so we're going to get our guesses in and probably do one more before the Chargers finally release their 53. But first, we got a bunch of people joining the Patreon, so want to give a quick little shout-out before we begin. I'll start off here. Big shout-out to Christian Lowe.
Thank you to Charles E.,
Joe Cruz,
Jarrett Starnes,
Dante Jackson,
Andrew,
Daniel Lay,
David Drogemeyer,
Scott Richardson,
Jay-Z,
and DB. So 2 letters, Jay-Z and then DB. So thank you, everybody. Join the Patreon. Appreciate it. It's going to be a fun ride here as the season is about to start in the Discord. So if you haven't already, go ahead and join over there. And just remember everything we do in the Discord, at least all the information we get, because I know a lot of people were upset that we're putting it in our Discord. It'll eventually get out. Eventually. Everybody gets it. So just thanks, everybody, for joining, and we appreciate all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for joining. And like Garrett said, anything that hits the Discord eventually makes its way onto the show. It's just a matter of kind of how sensitive it is and how long we think we should wait before we release it.
For sure. And all the J.C. Jackson news is already out on the injury updates, so everybody's got a update on that from everybody else now. So we're all good. So, Jamie, we're going to go ahead and get into this thing. Let's go ahead and just start. And it's real easy to begin with because for special teams, which is what we want to get out of the way first, there are no other players on the rosters at their positions. So it's Dustin Hopkins, J.K. Scott as the punter, Josh Harris as the long snapper. That's all locked in. That's really easy.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. There's no competition for those guys. We don't need to talk about it anymore. Let's move on.
Yeah, and now let's go straight to offense. And right before we do, because I'll let Jamie go ahead and start with quarterbacks, this is what we think the team is going to do. This is not what Garrett and Jamie are going to do, what we would do with the 53, but from what we've seen in preseason training camp, what we heard from Brandon Staley, Tom Telesco, this is what we think they will do when they release their 53. So, Jamie, with that setup, let's talk about quarterbacks.
All right. Well, this is pretty straightforward. We know from Tom Telesco's comments during the preseason game last week that the Chargers plan on keeping 3 quarterbacks. The only real question is who will be QB2 and who will be QB3. So we know the Chargers are going to roll into the regular season with some combination of Justin Herbert, Chase Daniel, and Easton Stick on the active roster. 2 of those guys will be active. 1 will be inactive. We're 2 years into the same position battle with Stick and Daniel, and nobody really seems to be standing out. So I would say right now, probably a pretty safe bet that Daniel wins QB2, but all 3 will be on the roster for sure.
Yeah, so not something we would do. We've said it in the past, but we're past that now. It's going, and Telesco and Staley have both said on separate occasions that they have a role for all 3 of these quarterbacks: Justin Herbert, Chase Daniel, Easton Stick. In no way, shape, or form should Chase Daniel or Easton Stick ever see the field unless Justin Herbert goes down. I sure hope that whole talk about having a role for those 3 is maybe a role in like the QB room, during film study, during practice. Any of that is fine with me. When you put either of those 2 players on the field with Justin Herbert perfectly healthy, that is a bad decision. Never take Justin Herbert off the field. He's too good. So I've got the same 3 quarterbacks. Chargers keeping Justin Herbert, Chase Daniel, and Easton Stick. So we agree there, Jamie. All right, so next up is running back. And this is also something that I would not do. And we're going to roll fullback into this too, by the way. But we know Austin Eckler's a starter. We know Joshua Kelly right now has kind of earned that, made a case at least for that RB3. I think when we roll into week 1, he might be RB2 early on, especially with Isaiah Spiller being week to week, but I think that'll take care of itself. And we'll see a lot more Spiller as the season goes on. So Isaiah Spiller, Austin Eckler, Joshua Kelly. Roundtree shouldn't be a part of this group, but Telesco has said they are going to keep those 4 running backs. So you're going to see Austin Eckler, Isaiah Spiller, Joshua Kelly, and Larry Roundtree. And then for fullback in this group, I think Xander Horvath has had a really nice camp. Gabe Neighbors has kind of been quiet all through camp of the preseason. Also without Neighbors having that real special teams role anymore. I think with Horvath being the recent pick and how he's done in the preseason, I've got Xander Horvath over Gabe Neighbors as the fullback. So I've got 5 in this group: Austin Eckler, Isaiah Spiller, Joshua Kelly, Larry Roundtree, and then Xander Horvath.
Yeah, I had the same group. Telesco said they were going to keep 4 running backs. He didn't necessarily say they were going to keep those 4, but I think those are the 4 they keep because nobody behind them is any good.
No.
So not that Roundtree is any good either, but he was a recent draft pick, and they seem determined to find a role for him or find a reason to keep him. So it seems like Eckler, Kelly, Spiller, and Roundtree will be the 4 halfbacks. And I agree with Horvath. You add to that, comments by Daniel Popper saying that he feels like Horvath was drafted to be a core special teamer. And that's a role that that Gabe Neighbors hasn't really filled as often as they thought he would when they kept him last year. I think Horvath is going to make this team. So those are the 5 running backs.
Yeah, and just of this group, like you were mentioning, I mean, full disclosure, I was very happy, and I thought there was going to be a pretty big competition with Letty Brown and Kevin Marks for the practice squad spot. That was before the preseason. Since the preseason, I don't think they've made a case at all for the practice squad. I don't think they're even good enough to keep around. I think you could find somebody else to fill that role if you wanted it. So while keeping Brown or Marks would be just fine, I don't see any of those cracking the 53, and I'm not even sure they really would crack the practice squad if it were me. So, both of which I had high hopes for, neither of which I'd really keep on the practice squad if it were me.
Yeah, I think one of them probably does stick on the practice squad just to have somebody on the practice squad, but that's all it is. It's just a warm body for the most part. So, yeah, I think the big question is really how that RB2 role is going to fill out. It seems like the team is really dedicated to the idea of giving Kelly every opportunity to win that job. And now with Isaiah Spiller dealing with the ankle injury from last week, it seems like Kelly now has a pretty firm grip on the RB2 role. We know Kelly, whenever they were rotating guys in with the first group in camp, Kelly got most of the snaps with the first team offense at running back. So it seems like he's going to break camp as the RB2. I think you probably see Spiller as kind of a short yardage, maybe a fourth quarter closer type, maybe see him in goal line packages. And I think ultimately the goal is to have him expand into that RB2 role and have him and Eckler on the same field together so they can.
And he's frozen. Jamie's chunked out and
younger, stronger Spiller.
Good. Okay. You froze there for a little bit, but we got most of it. So, all right. Well, we agree with the running backs, or the halfbacks at least. So let's move on to wide receiver. Jamie, how many do you have him keeping?
I have him keeping 5.
Okay.
Not what I would do, but I think they're going to leave themselves with no choice but to keep 5 because of the way they're putting together other roster spots. So I have the Chargers keeping Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Joshua Palmer as the clear wide receiver 3 in this offense, Jalen Guyton, and DeAndre Carter. I know everybody loves Michael Bandy. I've enjoyed watching him play. I think he is probably one of the more deserving, quote unquote, bottom of the roster candidates on this team. He has earned a roster spot, but because of the stupid, dumbass way they're going to construct quarterback and running back, and probably tight end out of necessity, they're not going to be able to keep 6 wide receivers. And I think Bandy probably loses a spot he really should wind up getting. Okay.
Well, this is where we're going to differ because, we know Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Joshua Palmer, DeAndre Carter, all locks to make the roster. Jalen Guyton up and down this camp, but, I think they're going to elect to keep him as depth, which they probably should. But with as good as Michael Bandy has been this offseason and throughout the preseason, I just don't know that you can put him on the waiver wire and think that you can maybe sneak him onto the practice squad. So it seems to me every year Tom Telesco keeps one or two guys that have earned a spot. And they keep them, and then maybe a week or two later, a couple days later, they end up cutting them, sneaking them in that second, third wave of free agents there, and then sneak them onto the practice squad. I think this is one of those make good with a guy that has earned a spot throughout camp and throughout the preseason, and they keep 6 wide receivers, and Michael Bandy's one of them, which means I'm going to have to cut later, and we'll get to that. But I've got them keeping 6. Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Joshua Palmer, DeAndre Carter, Jalen Guyton, Michael Bandy. So I got Bandy being this year's candidate to make that 53 because he's earned it. And then also, I think Trevon Bradford is a strong practice squad candidate. And like Jamie and I both agree here, they're going to finally cut ties with wideouts like Joe Reed and Jason Moore this time around.
Yeah, neither one of those guys has really earned a spot. Reed flashed quickly in week 1 and then was quickly gone again. Sorry, Craig.
Yeah.
But yeah, if they do keep 6, it's going to be Bandy. I just don't know how they do that. I think there are other guys who have earned spots who may or may not be able to get them, who they might choose to keep over Bandy. So we'll see how that plays out. But he's definitely deserving.
Okay, and I'll tell you where I cut a little bit later on. So, all right, tight end, you kind of alluded to it. They're going to have to keep an extra one here. Gerald Everett, the starter. We know Donald Parham, Trey McKitty are going to be there as some depth role players this year, but because Donald Parham and Trey McKitty haven't been able to stay healthy, they're going to have to keep a 4th tight end. And none of the tight ends have really made enough noise to say, hey, we got to keep this guy. But I think by default, Hunter Kampmoyer, with his special teams contribution last year and how important that 4th tight end spot would be for a special teams type role, I think they end up keeping Kampmoyer as a tight end 4. I think Sage Surratt has made some plays. Croman Hoke has been all but quiet. So I think they go with the guy who's familiar with the system. He has a special teams value, and that's Kampmoyer for me. So I think once cuts happen, I think this is a spot, this tight end 4, you might be able to get a depth guy in tight end that might be able to help on special teams too, and hit up that waiver wire for that 4th tight end, and then sneak Kampmoyer onto your practice squad later. So this is a spot I think they could probably go in the waiver wire, dip in there and find some kind of veteran presence, maybe even some special teams value with a young guy over Kampmoyer, who has done next to nothing this offseason and in training camp, but has special teams value and did it last year. So I think by default they keep Gerald Everett, Donald Parham, Trey McKitty, and then Hunter Kampmoyer.
Yeah, I think this is pretty straightforward. They have to keep a 4th tight end because they still don't know what they have in Parham or McKitty over the course of a full season. And neither one of them has been healthy for the majority of camp. So they have to keep Kampmoyer. I don't think the other tight ends have really done anything to earn that spot. And Kampmoyer has been running with the ones on special teams for the most part throughout camp. So I think that kind of tells you what they're thinking. Seems like they're looking for a reason to keep him. And I think they will. So Hunter Kampmoyer stays as the 4th tight end. I've got Everett, Parham, McKitty, and Kampmoyer as my 4 tight ends.
There you go. We agree there. Okay. Offensive line. This is the last of the offense here. Offensive line. How many you got them keeping?
9.
Same.
Have them keeping 9 offensive linemen. They're keeping, obviously, Rashawn Slater, Matt Filer, Corey Lindsley, Zion Johnson, and Trey Pipkins, who, based on everything being reported out of camp this week, it seems like Pipkins is kind of strengthening his grip on that starting right tackle job.
Yep.
I think it was a foregone conclusion going into camp. There was very little chance Storm Norton was going to beat him out unless Pipkins just completely fell flat. And Pipkins has at least been serviceable through the preseason, whereas I think Norton has struggled a lot more in the preseason. So those are your 5 starting offensive linemen. And then in terms of the backups, they keep Storm Norton because they have no other tackle worth keeping.
Yep.
Jamari Salyer, who I would still love to see play some right tackle, maybe in the 3rd game of the preseason. Will Clapp and Brendan Hymas.
Yeah, I got the same 9. It's nice to see Pipkins at least kind of widening that gap a little bit with right tackle because it was very close for a little bit too long. I mean, they gave Norton every chance he could, but it wasn't like Trey Pipkins ran away with the job early on. But he was, I agree with Jamie, definitely better than Storm Norton throughout this preseason. So he'll be your starting right tackle come week 1. I've also, Storm Norton, same swing tackle, Jamari Salyer, Brendan Hymas, and then Will Clapp as your backup center. There just hasn't been any other offensive lineman that even like pushed any of these guys. Nobody really stood out. There wasn't really a competition. This was kind of the group you thought would make it, and nobody else kind of went backwards or forward. They all just kind of stayed pat, and this is the group you're going to have. But I will say that throughout camp and in the preseason, Will Clapp has been an absolute liability with the 2s and 3s. And I would not be surprised, and if it were me, I'd look at the waiver wire and look for that backup center because he's a veteran, and at this point, if you're not separating yourselves in these twos and threes, I think you might be able to find somebody who might be able to do that as a backup center and kind of an insurance plan for if Corey Linsley ever goes down. So I got them keeping Slater, Filer, Linsley, Johnson, Pipkins, Norton, Sawyer, Hymas, and Will Clapp as well. But I would not be surprised if they went after another center and just dropped Will Clapp.
Yeah, I think another spot where they might be able to make an upgrade is Brendan Hymas. I know he was a recent draft pick, but I don't feel like he's really done anything to stand out in the preseason.
No, he hasn't.
Don't remember seeing him flash or make any great blocks. I think he had some struggles last week in the second preseason game. So he's a guy who I think they're going to keep because they're invested in him and they feel like they're developing him. But maybe if a veteran, God, please don't let it be Michael Schofield, but maybe if a veteran shows up that they feel can fill that spot better, maybe they decide that Hymas isn't the answer and they bring in another kind of swing interior lineman. But for sure, those are two spots with Clapp and Hymas that I think they could look to make a move on the waiver wire depending on what happens the first wave of cuts.
Yeah, and Hymas did practice some center. I saw some in camp too. So if they wanted to get another veteran guard, swing Hymas into center and get rid of Clapp, they could do that too. But yeah, those two guys have just haven't done enough to really cement themselves as backup and earning that 53 spot, but nobody else has pushed them for that, so they're going to make the roster, and we'll see when cuts come if they're going to replace any of them. All right, so defense. We're going to start interior defensive line, work our way out to DBs, and on the defensive line, I've got 5. We know SJD, Austin Johnson, and Tito are locks. Morgan Fox has been with the starters all throughout camp, so he is in, and the last spot comes down to Jerry Tillery, Christian Covington, Brendan Fehoko, and Joe Gaziano. And while Covington was a fine veteran piece last year, I think with how late he played in that game last week, and Jerry Tillery for that matter, I think their spots are pretty much in jeopardy. Jerry Tillery has been ineffective with the 2s and 3s. He has done nothing as a pass rusher, got in the backfield once, and he's getting run over in the run game. They're just running it right at him a couple times. So he is being completely ineffective and going the wrong way. And I think Brendan Fehoko has progressed enough to be a depth defensive lineman, but I think with keeping 3 quarterbacks and 4 running backs, he is one of my last cuts here. And I'm going with Joe Gaziano. I'm giving him the edge. He continues to impress as that 6D lineman, which means the Chargers cut Christian Covington. They cut Jerry Tillery. I do think a guy like Carlo Kemp, I almost said Carlos. I want to say Carlos because it looks like Carlos, but there's no S. Carlo Kemp is worth a stash in the practice squad. So I went back and forth on Fehoko and Gaziano. I think the versatility of Gaziano, a little bit being able to play inside and out, and just that energy that we talked about gives him a leg up over Fehoko, who kind of struggled last week. So I've got Sebastian Joseph Day, Austin Johnson, Morgan Fox, Tito Abonia, and Joe Gaziano as my 5 defensive linemen.
I also have them keeping 5. Our top 4 are the same: Sebastian Joseph Day, Austin Johnson, Morgan Fox, and Otito Abonia. I have them keeping Braden Fehoko. I think it's really going to come down to who plays better this last preseason game between Gaziano and Fehoko.
Agreed.
Fehoko was really good week 1 of the preseason. He was pretty much invisible last week. Gaziano was borderline electric last week as a pass rusher. And I think if they're looking at Tillery as somebody who has pass rushing juice and they're trying to find a good reason to cut him and replace him, then Gaziano is the guy that they would probably want to go with from a pass rushing perspective and from a versatility perspective. But I think they probably want to see one more game out of both Fehoko and Gaziano before they make a decision.
Agreed.
So right now I have Fehoko, but I think it could easily be Gaziano. I went back and forth on them as well.
Yeah.
I think having that third pass rusher probably might ultimately win out, but I went with Fehoko for the purposes of this exercise.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why I went with him too. Just knowing that Tito's more of your run stuffing interior defensive lineman, getting some more pass rush with Gaziano, I think will help. So, I just like you went back and forth with Fehoko and Gaziano, and it's really going to be this last game that decides that fifth and final defensive line spot. And we both agree, no Christian Covington and no Jerry Tillery.
Yep. Yeah, I thought Covington was kind of a lock to make the roster when they re-signed him, but he has not played very well, and I think they've got younger, better options. And Tillery is a guy who, I mean, he's been on the field, and he's on the field because he's getting run over in the running game. But he has not been very productive. He's not been offering much as a pass rusher, and I think they've set themselves up to be able to move on without him. So it's just, I mean, there's always a possibility he could have a great third game and lock a spot down as a former first-round pick. But I just think Fehoko and Gaziano have shown better in the preseason and are more deserving of that spot, and I think one of them is going to get it.
Yeah. Okay. All right, then. We agree. This is it for Jerry Tillery. All right, so edge rushers. How many you got?
I have them keeping 4. And I have them obviously keeping Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, and Chris Rumph. And I went back and forth between Jamal Davis and Carlo Kemp because Kemp is on the roster as an edge player, even though he's a little bit bigger than some of the edge players on the roster. He's kind of a hybrid. He's plays like 285, so he's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
But I have them keeping Jamal Davis. I could see the argument for keeping either one. I think Davis had a really good week 2, had a couple tackles for loss and a quarterback hit. He's shown up a little bit in both games. I think, the technique isn't there. He doesn't use his length real well, but he's a UDFA for a reason, and he's at least got some traits. We talk about JT Woods, the team drafting JT Woods for traits. I think Jamal Davis is a guy they could very well keep for traits. So it could go either way, but I think they started camp with Davis having the inside track. I think Carlo Kemp has worked his way up to certainly being on the practice squad and might sneak his way onto the roster. But I think at the end of the day, they go with Davis, who's kind of a more pure stand-up edge rusher for this system than Carlo Kemp is.
Yeah, and both Kemp and Davis leapfrogging Emeka Egbule, who basically had that edge 4 spot, but has fallen down that depth chart. So I agree with you. I think Egbule gets cut too. So this is where I made my cuts. I added an extra wide receiver, Michael Bandy, and I have them keeping 3 edge players, and I'll tell you why. So it's Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, and then Chris Rumph has obviously earned a role as a situation pass rusher. So I have them keeping 3 edge rushers because we know that Van Noy will be playing the inside linebacker, but will also be rushing off the edge from time to time as well. You've also got guys like Kenneth Murray who can rush off the edge, Joe Gaziano who could also... Well, I mean... He has in the past. He's been experience. He's been asked to rush off the edge. Yes. As a depth guy, we're talking about the 5th edge here. And then also Joe Gaziano, who rushed off the edge in college and has rushed off the edge sparingly, but can do it as well. So I think the team can afford to have quote unquote 3 edge players in name only, knowing that there's some other guys on this roster that can fit in if injuries occur or they need a 4th pass rusher. And they've got a lot of other versatility in this DB group that can rush off the edge. So I have them keeping 3. I think both Jamal Davis and Carlo Kemp, while I mentioned Kemp with the defensive lineman, both Kemp and Davis should earn practice squad spots, no doubt. And I think if they were going to keep a 4th edge rusher, I would have kept Jamal Davis. I agree with Jamie there over Carlo Kemp. But in my scenario, I think they got to keep Michael Bandy so they can keep him on the roster and then swap him out later on for probably another edge player. And so I have them keeping 3, Bosa, Mack, and Rumph. And that's where I made my cut to add Michael Bandy.
That's ballsy, only keeping 3 true edge rushers.
Well, if you've got you got some versatility on this roster, so I'm okay with doing it right now. So
I'm not sure Tom Telesco's ballsy enough to do something like that.
I mean, they've spared on position groups before. Last year they did it with safety, where they were very raw. I think they only kept 3. Was it last year or the year before? They only kept 3 safeties.
I think they kept 4 because they had Webb too.
I'll look into it, but they've done that before where they've kept a group so low that it kind of freaks you out a little bit, but then they end up evening things out a little bit later before week 1. So, all right, so I've got 3 there, and that's where I kind of made up for my Michael Bandy keep there. So linebacker, I've got 5. Kyle Van Noy, Drew Tranquil, they're going to be on the field together a lot. Kenneth Murray's back. He's obviously going to make the 53. I think Troy Reeder is a good bet to make it as some veteran depth, even though he's played throughout this preseason kind of deep in games. I think he's locked in at that linebacker 3-4 spot. And then for me, it came down to Nick Niemann and Amin Ambangamiga for one spot. And I have them keeping Nick Niemann for his special teams prowess. Neiman was the team leader on special teams tackle. He was 7th in the league in that category last year. I think Bong, he was my absolute last cut. He was my 54th guy that I ended up having to swap out. So I think Bong, in my mind, has been playing pretty late in preseason, much like Covington. I know they had plans for Amin, but he's been pretty quiet in camp, in games, and I think they need an extra DB because of this J.C. Jackson injury. So I had to make Bong my very, very last cut. He was 54 on my list, so I ended up keeping 5. Kyle Van Noy, Drew Tranquil, Kenneth Murray, Troy Reeder, Nick Niemann, and in that scenario, you move Amin to the practice squad.
I also have them keeping 5. My top 4 are the same. I kept Amin over Nick Niemann.
Okay.
And I went back and forth on this. And I can see the reasoning for keeping Niemann over Amin because Niemann played more special team snaps last year, although Amin's special team snaps peaked towards the end of the year last year. I think that they signed Troy Reeder to take over that special teams linebacker role. I think he's going to be a core special teamer, and that gives them some flexibility in what they want to do with that 5th linebacker spot. And in my opinion, I think Ogbongbemiga, he played more on defense than Neiman did last year. So if they have someone like a Reeder who they think is going to be a core special teamer, and they have someone they want to develop who they've already shown that they trust more on defense than they do Nick Niemann, I think they opt to keep that person who also has some special teams value. So I think the fact that Amin played more on defense last year, saw his special team snap increase towards the end of the year last year, I think Amin winds up getting that spot, and he is coming off of a 6-tackle, 2-run stop game last week against the Cowboys. So he did flash a couple times last week.
Sound reasoning. I totally understand. Like the Fahoko Gaziano argument we had earlier, I think it comes down to the last preseason game, and I could easily see them going either way. If I'm general manager, I'm keeping Bong over Neiman, but I just think with this focus on special teams, I think they end up going that route, but I think this third game is going to be really, really important for both of them.
I agree.
So we got our DBs here. Last 2 groups, corner and safety. Jamie, let's talk about corners. Who you got?
I had them keeping 5 corners, and I don't think there's an opportunity to keep a 6th, and I don't think there is anybody beyond these 5 who really should be on the active roster. So my 5 are J.C. Jackson, Michael Davis, Asante Samuel Jr., Bryce Callahan, and Jasir Taylor. Taylor has been really good in practice and camp. He picked off Justin Herbert again yesterday. They love him in the slot, and they feel like he can play some star and some money. And he's also looked pretty good at gunner so far in the preseason, which is something that they've been searching for. So I think Taylor has that 5th cornerback spot locked up. I think it's pretty much a slam dunk that he's going to make the roster. And I don't think there's anybody behind him who can push him or is even worth keeping as a 6th corner. So those are my 5. And I think, if you're looking at things to watch for this week, you mentioned the linebacker battle with Neiman and Amin. I think the other battle to watch here is who's going to win that CB2 job, because it seems like Michael Davis is strengthening his stranglehold on that position at this point. Something we didn't expect coming into camp, but he has played all over the field, inside, outside. He's looked really good. He's had a couple pass breakups. He's tackling better. He just looks more comfortable and more confident. And we haven't seen as much of the same from Asante Samuel Jr. So I think that is one thing. That's one position battle that's still very much up for grabs. And I think that's going to be something that's interesting to watch tomorrow night. Yep,
absolutely. Yeah, good call. And I've got the same 5. Yeah, I think it's between Jasir Taylor, Dean Leonard, and Kamon Hall all fighting for one spot there. And Dean Leonard has had just way too many struggles to keep him on the 53. But I think once they cut him, he's an automatic for the practice squad because they drafted him. He needs some more time to develop for sure. So I think that's a guy you stash on the practice squad, but you don't keep on the 53. Kamon Hall might be a guy that you can make a case for making the 53. He pitched in that DB group last year when they were decimated by injuries. He cleaned up on special teams last year, but Jasir Taylor has flashed and looked better and made some real wow plays this preseason. You could really see the athleticism and just how quick he is to the ball, and it just feels like the game is really slowing down for him, and he's starting to really get into his groove. So I agree, Jasir Taylor is the fifth corner, and I thought about keeping Hall here as some kind of like J.C. Jackson insurance, but I think there's another guy I ended up keeping in the safety group for some versatility. So whether J.C. Jackson's out week 1, he's not going to be out long. So I think just keeping 5 here, you're all right. And I think Dean Leonard and even Kamon Hall could have a chance at practice squad.
Yeah, I think Leonard definitely makes the practice squad.
Mm-hmm.
I think Kamon Hall is a guy who had a really good shot at making the team early in camp.
Yeah.
But has just been outplayed. And even with the growth that he showed on special teams last year and the way that he had to play, I think a lot more than anybody anticipated last year, I just think being a recent pick and with the way Taylor has played, Taylor is a lock to make the roster. And I'd love to see Hall make the practice squad and get some more developmental time in the system.
For sure. All right, so last up here, I've got 5 safeties. Derwin James and Nasir Adderley are your starters. JT Woods is depth, and they obviously spent high draft capital on him, so he's in. Alohi Gilman has had a ton of work when Derwin's been out, so he's a strong safety depth there. And I flipped back and forth on whether I wanted to keep Amin or Mark Webb, and I ended up going with Mark Webb as my 53rd player, just because he's got some versatility. They had some big plans for him. He can't stay healthy, which is the biggest issue, and this might mess up our whole 53 if they put him on PUP or, they want to save him for later in the year because he's still not healthy. But to me, with the versatility, waiting for J.C. Jackson to come back, keeping a 5th safety here in Mark Webb makes a ton of sense. And so I end up keeping Derwin James, Nasir Adderley, J.T. Woods, Alohi Gilman, and Mark Webb here.
I have them keeping the same 5. The one consideration, and you mentioned it, is maybe they put Webb on the PUP and they use that as the way to keep a guy like a Michael Bandy, who otherwise might not make it.
Yep.
I think that's maybe more likely than keeping 3 edge players, but Webb is a guy that I know they love. I know they have big plans for him. They see him playing all over the defense. I think they're probably afraid they would lose him if they cut him. I'm not sure they would. This is a guy who has, I think, 2 games of tape last regular season, hardly played last preseason, hasn't played this preseason, isn't going to play this preseason, I don't think, and hasn't been on the field throughout training camp, at least for the last 2 or 3 weeks. So to me, I think that's a guy who with such a shortage of film on him, being that he was like a 7th round pick and he's been so banged up, it doesn't seem like that's the kind of guy people would rush to pick up if you cut him. And you might be able to sneak him onto the practice squad, but it's probably more likely if he's not ready to go that they put him on the PUP and use that to carry somebody extra who earned it before they move that person down later.
Yeah, he's definitely a candidate. And just going back to something I mentioned earlier, so they in 2020 is when the Chargers kept 3 safeties on the roster: Rayshon Jenkins, Nasir Adderley, and Alohi Gilman. Aren't we glad that we don't have to hear Rayshon so much anymore?
Ugh.
So let's look at where our teams line up here. I'm gonna pull this up here. So here's my 53 here. From defense, offense, we got our special teams there lined up. Got my 3 edge players: Tito, Sebastian Day. I've got Joe Gaziano, Michael Bandy down here. We pretty much got a lot of the same, but there are some differences. Here's Jamie's 53. Just a quick little look here. He's got Fehoko. And then I'm going to show you where we differ here. Let me see here. Because I just put that together while we were kind of talking. let's see, it's here. So here's where we differ. I'm in the blue. Jamie's kind of in the magenta here. So I've got Nick Neiman. He's got Amon in the linebackers. I've got Gaziano, and he's got Fehoko. Jamie's got Jamal Davis here as a fourth edge, and I've got Michael Bandy. These numbers are obviously wrong, but I've got Michael Bandy here in the blue, and that's kind of where we differ. We picked different linebackers, different interior defensive linemen, and you got him keeping Jamal Davis as a fourth edge, and I got him keeping Michael Bandy as a sixth wide receiver. And
Otherwise,
that
not
is
too
it.
different.
No, not at all. And we'll kind of see as we go how it's going to go after the game tomorrow. So that's our 53 part 1. I'm sure we'll get on here and have something after the game maybe, or Jamie and I will talk and figure that out. But I know 53 cuts will happen soon. So that's what we got so far in part 1. Thank you so much, everybody. We appreciate you, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Nailed it that time, Jamie, finally.